What's up everyone, Chris from Full Steam Designs, and today I'm going to show you how I built this cabinet that's actually a place to hide laundry baskets. It has a ton of cool features like these door panels that I cut out on my CNC router, and round legs that you won't need a lathe to make. Stick around and I'll show you how to build your own. I'll also show you some of the mistakes I made so you can avoid them. I've got a decent sized garage, but still don't have enough room to cut down a full sheet of plywood with the way my table saw is oriented. I always start my projects by breaking down the plywood with my track saw, and then cutting everything to the final dimensions on the table saw. I'm going to post a detailed cut list for the carcass of this cabinet on my website in case you want to build your own. I'll have that and some links to the products I used in this video posted in the description. There's a lot of different ways to assemble a cabinet, but I like using dados. It takes a little extra time to cut all the pieces, but makes the assembly process a breeze. For me, the easiest way to do them is with my router table. I set the depth to 1/4 of an inch using these setup gauges, and then use a square to set the length from the side of my bit to my fence. This measurement doesn't have to be dead on. A 1/16 of an inch either way won't hurt anything. What is important though is that all of these pieces are cut at the same time, so all of the dados line up with each other. For the rabbets along the edge, I clamp a sacrificial piece of wood to the fence and move it over until it just barely touches the bit. These next dados are for the brackets that the baskets will hang on. I made a story stick to help set the fence to the right position. Once again, I'm cutting all of my parts before moving the fence. The middle divider is a 1/2 inch shorter because it fits into a dado at the top of the cabinet. Instead of adjusting my fence, I just clamp a 1/2 inch piece of plywood to it before making the cut. To keep track of stuff, I try to orient the pieces so I make sure the cuts are going in the right places. I have the left and right sides on the table behind me, and the middle is leaning against my CNC router. Unfortunately, I forgot that I need to do both sides of this middle piece, so I had to go back and do the other side. Don't make that mistake. Once all of the dados are cut, it's time to assemble the pieces. Everything seemed to be fine until I discovered mistake number 2. I spent a lot of time planning this stuff out, and even modeled it in Fusion 360. But I measured the wrong part of the drawing and failed to add in the width of the rabbet. The top and bottom panels ended up getting cut 3/4 of an inch too narrow. Instead of wasting material and remaking them, I just trimmed 3/4 of an inch off the other pieces. This will make them a little short, but I've got an easy fix that I'll show you for that. Now that everything fits as it should, I can finish getting the carcass assembled. Next, I ripped a couple strips of maple. These pieces will make the brackets that hold the baskets, and will also be the extra thick edge banding needed to fix my last mistake. I cut them to length and used my router table to put an 1/8 inch round over on the corners. I cut the edge banding to length as I go, and secure it with glue and brad nails. I like to sneak up on these cuts, so sometimes it takes me a few trips to the miter saw before they fit perfect. I sanded the outside and face of the edge banding before using the same 1/8 inch round over on all the corners. The router bit can't get these inside corners, so I come back and clean them up with a chisel and a little more sanding. My go-to for filling screw holes and scratches for painted pieces of furniture is Bondo. It's cheap, cures quick and is super hard, but still allows for some flex. It's got some pretty strong solvents, so be sure to use it in a well-ventilated area, and wear a respirator when sanding. I usually mix about a golf ball sized scoop of filler with about an inch-long line of hardener. You can adjust the ratio to make it kick off faster or slower by reducing the amount of hardener. Just make sure it's mixed thoroughly. To fill any minor imperfections, I brush on a couple coats of primer. I sand a 220 grit between coats. Next, I rolled on a few coats of black paint, again sanding to 220 grit between coats. Now we can move on to the legs. These are one of my favorite parts of this build. I started with a 2 by 2 1/4 inch strip of ash and used this huge 1-inch router bit to put a radius on the edges. I did this in 2 passes by adjusting the fence. I left about an inch on each end so I would have a reference for the next step. I screwed a piece of scrap to each end of the leg to act as a guide and to prevent the piece from rotating. I used a leftover piece of 80/20 as a fence on my bandsaw. This helped me keep everything square. I cut most of the way down the length of the leg, stopping at a mark I made about 7 inches from the end. Next, I used the trenching feature on my miter saw to cut to the slot I made with my bandsaw. This is the face that will sit against the cabinet. I wanted to add a flat to the other side of the leg, so I screwed another piece of scrap to the notch that I just created. I used a 6-inch gauge block to trim the excess material off the bottom of the leg. Next, I used my bandsaw to make the other cut, this time stopping when the material hit the fence. I wanted to add a curve to the bottom of this cut. I used some painter's tape and drew a line roughly where I wanted it. For this cut, I removed the fence from my bandsaw, but still used a small piece of scrap screwed to the back of the leg to keep it square. Now I can peel off the tape and use it as a template to mark the other legs. To clean this up, I used my oscillating belt sander. This is a great tool to add to your shop if you don't already have one. I did a bunch more sanding on the legs and brushed on a couple coats of shellac. I used a fine scuff pad to knock down the shine a little and smooth the finish out. Attaching the legs was easy. I just inset them an inch from the edge, pre-drilled some holes, and ran my screws through from the inside. Used a thin line of CA glue to help hold them in place while attaching the screws. Originally, I started marking the legs to be trimmed to length on the miter saw, but found it easier just to use an oscillating multi-tool. Now it's time to make some doors. At first, I was just going to make regular panel doors, but instead I decided to make frames that would have removable inserts. I used a couple different router bits to make these. The first cuts a groove in the inside of the rails and stiles. That's the horizontal and vertical parts. I used a test piece to help set the height of these to where I needed the grooves to be. Next, I changed over to the double groove bit and ran the end of each rail through. The idea here is that the space between the two cutters should line up with the single groove cut on the inside. Because the material was a little thicker than my test piece, I ended up with an extra piece that needed to get trimmed off. These grooves allow everything to lock together and make for a really strong frame. Usually a panel would be sitting inside this groove, but since I'm making these panels removable, there's another step I need to do. I used a 1/2 inch rabbiting bit in my router to remove the material on one side of the channel. This was going fine until disaster struck. It's hard to tell because my arm is right in the middle of the shot, but the collet of my router loosened up and allowed the bit to come out. Fortunately, it didn't come right through the face of the frame, but it still left a pretty nasty gouge. Let's call this mistake number 3, but really, who's counting? If this piece was for someone else, I'd probably remake the frame, but since it's for me, I decided to repair it. I removed the rest of the material and glued in strips to repair the damage. Since it's on the inside, it's really hard to see. Normally I'd say something like, well, I'll know it's there, but honestly, I don't even notice. I used a chisel to square up the rounded inside corners. In the next frame, I made sure to take multiple passes to prevent this from happening again. It was at this point that I realized I had made another mistake. This is number 4, I suppose. Instead of subtracting 2 inches for each style when figuring out the width that I needed to make the rails for my door frames, I only subtracted 1 of them. This left my frames 2 inches too wide. I was in no mood to remake anything, so I decided just to remove 1 inch from each side of the door frame. It's a little unconventional, I suppose, but it actually looked pretty nice after it was done. I knew in the back of my mind that this could cause an issue with the hinges, as the European style I planned to use would no longer work, but that was a problem for future Chris to deal with. This time I decided to spray the shellac. It just seemed easier, and it was. There's a number of companies that sell panels with patterns cut into them, but I figured this would be a good opportunity to put my CNC router to use. I designed this pattern in Carveco Maker, cut it out of 1/4 inch PVC. I used an 1/8 inch O-flue bit I got from my buddy Bill over at cncbits.ca. This was my first time cutting PVC, and it worked great. I guess now it's time to talk about hinges. These didn't work. Neither did these, or these. But these did. These are for a 1/4 inch overlay frameless cabinet. I inset them about a 1/4 inch from the edge. The idea behind the inserts is that they will allow airflow, can be removed and swapped out for different designs in the future if this one gets boring. I'm a pretty big fan of it though, so I don't see that happening anytime soon. Okay, last step, the top. I ripped a few more pieces of ash and flipped the boards around until I found a nice layout. I marked it with an arrow to keep them in order and then laid out spots for biscuits. These aren't really necessary, but they help with alignment, and with the way this project has been going, I just needed an easy win here. To keep everything flat, I like to use a couple pieces of 80/20 with some micro jig match fit clamps. A couple more clamps in the middle won't hurt either. This is probably a good time to mention that you aren't supposed to use these foam brushes with shellac because the denatured alcohol breaks them down. Sometimes you just gotta use what you have though. I'm so happy with the way this cabinet came out. The carcass is the only part that I really planned. Everything else just sort of came together on its own. I'd love to know what you think about this cabinet in the comments. What would you have done different? Did you learn anything from this project? Did you absolutely hate it? Seriously, let me know. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate if you hit that like button and share this video with your friends. All of that stuff really helps me out. Until next time, here's a few more videos that YouTube thinks you might like.